It's Saturday night and you're with the Saturday 5. I'm Darren Grimes and let's crack on with tonight's first debate. Our first victim tonight is going to be Benjamin Butterworth. And tonight, Benjamin, and I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, but Benjamin's going to try and tell us why we should pay more for the BBC.
Yeah.
Let's start the clock.
Buckle up, why we should pay more for the BBC. It's been announced that the licence fee is to go probably from £159 up to £172 a year. But some cabinet ministers want to block that £13 increase. Well, I say more fool them. The BBC is a national institution we should be as proud of as we are Her late Majesty the Queen. It's trusted around the world. Take, for example, the BBC World Service. Countries that are rising, being war-torn in the farthest depths of Earth. They trust the World Service. How much does it cost us? £1.28. Gary Lineker has made a lot of headlines. He's on £1.35 million a year. But how much do we actually pay for BBC television? Well, everything from Match of the Day to Line of Duty, £6.42. These are bargains. Look at Sky TV. Their cheapest package costs £26 a month. And the worst part about that, you have to fund Kay Burley with that amount. I say we'd be idiots to get rid of the BBC. We'd be idiots to start defunding it and letting it go derelict. Be even more stupid a decision than Brexit. But what do the panel think?
Benjamin, I actually vehemently disagree with everything that you've just said. Because if the BBC is so fantastic, why can it not survive without the coercive control of threatening people with prison if they don't pay the licence fee?
I mean, I think like any tax, you know, anything that you have to pay for if you're going to use the service. You know, if you tried to get Sky TV, I remember back in the day that you'd have sort of an antenna on your house and various neighbours could maybe get a bit of Sky without paying for it. Well, that would be a crime because you're getting something you're not paying for it. What do you think, Emily?
Well, I think that there might be a compromise in the middle, because the reason why a channel like GBNews exists is because people were sick and tired of what they perceived to be political bias. And I think it's pretty true that there was. I remember during the Brexit debate, time after time, BBC Question Time, one of their flagship news programmes, was constantly having 4 out of the 5 people on the panel being ardent Remainers. And that was just not representative of the country, and it continues to be. So they're trying their best to be a little bit more balanced. But I think a compromise might be to have a subscription service, then you can decide how much it's worth, how much you pay. You can choose to go for the BBC World Service, you can choose to go for the news service, you can choose to go for the Strictly Come Dancing, and then it's up to you.
Well, I love a bit of Strictly, but do you know what? It would cost far more if we did that, right? Because the fact it's so cheap, it is remarkably cheap. I mean, £6 for Strictly and Match of the Day and everything in between. That's incredible, and that's the per-month cost.
But if it's so popular, why not put it to people to choose to pay that amount? And I think the reality is they won't. Isn't that right?
I mean, if you don't want to watch the telly and you don't want to watch the BBC, then you don't have to.
But is it right that people are literally hunted down, threatened with prison for not paying this fee? Isn't that really quite dystopian?
I mean, look, it's very rare that that happens, right? So I think it's slightly exaggerated. And I definitely think that if you are a pensioner on a low income, but there are lots of wealthy pensioners who can definitely pay their own licence fee, or if you are in the category where you get discount off your council tax, for example, they shouldn't have to pay it. That sounds fair enough. But do you know what? I think we should value that kind of national institution, and the rest of the world values it. I think we'd be idiots to do that route, Dominique.
I think I agree with you on that, Benjamin. The BBC is not a perfect institution by any stretch of the imagination. I share the concerns about political bias that Emily was talking about during the Brexit referendum. But overall, I think all sides of politics feel that the BBC is biased, and therefore maybe it's actually doing quite a good job of impartiality. It's a national British institution, and I think
May I just say, we constantly hear this argument about, oh, well, if the right are angry and the left are angry, then it must be being impartial. That's not true. It's just representing no one, or it's representing a sort of soft, liberal, sort of Blairite type of view, one that Benjamin would agree with. That's why you are so pro-BBC.
Well, you have outed me as a Blairite, and I'm a proud Blairite. You know, people say, why do you join the Labour Party? I say, because Tony Blair is the greatest Prime Minister this country has ever had. And if that doesn't alienate all 4 of you, I don't know what does.
Let's see what the emails think.
But you know what? I think that the BBC does have an establishment bias. So it tends to be more conservative towards who is in power at the time because it has to be careful around who is shaping its funding. That's why, for example...
Isn't that dystopian, though? The fact that a state broadcaster must bend the way it comments on certain issues to the government of the day. I mean, I was an ardent critic of the lockdown policy, and the BBC failed. It failed massively to critique the lockdown policies, and I would argue that's because of this dystopian idea of a state broadcaster that we have in this country. But you agreed with the lockdown, so you wouldn't agree with that, did you?
I mean, I did agree with lockdowns because I didn't want to kill people's grandparents, frankly, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for most British people to have thought.
So we were told, though.
But, Benjamin, is it not the case, right, and Emily put it there, the BBC is an obvious lefty liberal institution packed full of people like yourself, and the only reason that you like it so much is because it speaks exclusively for people like you. Ultimately, the BBC has forgotten the British part of its name, and that's what we here at GB News get right. Isn't that right, Benjamin?
Well, I mean, that's some Grimes gibberish right there. You know, the truth is that the idea that the BBC has a left-wing bias is ridiculous, right? The Director-General of the BBC, a former Conservative Party councillor, the Chairman of the BBC, funded, or facilitated, rather, an £800,000 loan for Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The head of news at the BBC, and the BBC England, a person who appointed the head of news on the board of the BBC, set up GB News as a Conservative head of comms.
That may be true.
Tell me, how is that a left-wing liberal bias?
That may be true, but that is questionable. But if you took a poll of the people working at the BBC, the people choosing the editorial line, the people choosing the stories that go into the news, the people choosing who they have on to present, who they have on to do X, Y and Z, you will find that there is a liberal metropolitan bias. Far more likely to vote Labour than the general public. I think that is just true, it's demonstrable, and it's something...
Isn't that true
that many people...
Isn't that true of every major institution?
That's it.
Well, there we are, that's the klaxon.